Somewhere in a cave 30,000 years ago, someone spent days, not minutes, days, painting a horse on a wall by firelight. Nobody made them do it. Nobody paid them for it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What were they doing with all that time? Here's the question we're actually asking today. Not did ancient humans work hard. Obviously, survival required effort. We're not disputing that. The real question is stranger. How much of their day was actually consumed by survival? And here's the thing nobody tells you. The answer, according to a huge body of anthropological research, is a lot less than you'd assume. This idea traces back to a 1966 conference where anthropologist Marshall Solins presented data that genuinely stunned the room. Solins compiled observational studies of hunter-gatherer societies and argued, in what became his famous essay, The Original Affluent Society, that hunter-gatherers weren't living in constant, desperate scarcity at all. They were, by his estimate, working roughly 15 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activities, hunting, gathering, tool maintenance, and spending the rest of their waking hours resting, socializing, and doing more or less whatever they wanted. Let that sit for a second. Modern full-time employment in most industrialized countries runs somewhere around 40 hours a week, before you even count commuting, chores, or the mental residue of work that follows you home. Solins was suggesting that people living without agriculture, without stored food, without any of the systems we associate with security, were working less than half of that. This wasn't universally accepted right away, and it still gets debated on the specifics. But later, more rigorous studies backed up the general shape of his claim. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years directly observing the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, one of the last groups on Earth still living substantially off wild foods. His 2010 research found that Hadza adults spent, on average, well under 20 hours a week on direct subsistence work, hunting, digging tubers, collecting honey and berries. The rest of their time went to socializing, resting, childcare, and notably, an enormous amount of just sitting around talking. Now, here's where we have to be careful, because modern hunter-gatherer societies work relatively few hours, and all ancient humans throughout all of prehistory worked relatively few hours are two different claims, and the gap between them matters. Modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza aren't perfect time capsules of the deep past. They live in specific environments, interact with modern economies to varying degrees, and their circumstances have been shaped by thousands of years of history the same as everyone else's. Anthropologists use them as the closest living comparative model we have, not as a frozen replica of Paleolithic life. It's an inference, not a photograph. But the inference gets a lot stronger when you bring in a completely separate line of evidence: skeletons. In 1984, researchers Mark Cohen and George Armelagos published a landmark comparative study looking at skeletal remains from populations before and after the transition to agriculture. What they found was almost the exact opposite of what you'd expect if farming represented an unambiguous upgrade in human life. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer skeletons showed taller average stature, fewer signs of nutritional deficiency, and significantly less evidence of the repetitive strain damage associated with sustained physical labor. Early farmer skeletons, by contrast, showed shorter stature, more dental cavities from starch-heavy grain diets, more arthritis, and more skeletal stress markers consistent with long hours of repetitive physical work. This is a genuinely strange finding, because agriculture is usually taught as an unambiguous leap forward for humanity. And in some ways, long-term, it eventually allowed for population growth, permanent settlements, and everything that followed from those. But the bones are telling us that for the actual individuals living through that transition, early farming life may have been harder on the body, not easier, than the hunting and gathering life it replaced. So if hunter-gatherers weren't grinding away at survival all day, what were they actually doing with the rest of their time? This is where the archaeological evidence for leisure gets genuinely remarkable. In 1994, explorers discovered Chauvet Cave in southern France, containing paintings created roughly 30,000 years ago. Horses, lions, rhinoceroses, rendered with shading, perspective, and a clear sense of motion. These aren't crude scratches. They required planning, skill, and above all, time. Hours, likely days, spent deep inside a cave by firelight on something with zero survival function. Even older is the evidence from Blombos Cave in South Africa, where researcher Christopher Henshelwood and colleagues documented perforated shell beads dating back roughly 100,000 years. beads that, based on the specific shell species involved, appear to have been carried or traded from sources many miles away from the cave itself. Someone put in the effort to acquire specific shells, perforate them precisely, and string them as personal adornment. None of that keeps you alive. All of it takes time you'd only have if survival wasn't consuming every hour of your day. And then there's the Hohle Fels flute, discovered in Germany and dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, a wind instrument carefully carved from a bird's wing bone, with finger holes precisely spaced to produce distinct notes. Someone sat down with a bone, a cutting tool, and apparently enough free time to experiment with acoustics until they got the spacing right. Music, like cave painting and shell jewelry, isn't a survival technology. It's what humans reach for when survival isn't the only thing occupying their minds. Taken together, this pattern, skeletal evidence of relatively low physical strain, ethnographic evidence of relatively short working hours, and archaeological evidence of serious time investment in art, adornment, and music, points toward the same conclusion from three completely independent directions. For a huge stretch of human existence, a meaningful chunk of the day simply wasn't spoken for. So what did an actual day look like? Based on ethnographic observation of groups like the Hadza and the Juhonsi of the Kalahari, documented extensively by researcher James Sussman, a rough pattern emerges. Mornings might involve a short foraging or hunting trip, often just a few hours. Afternoons frequently involved processing food, tool maintenance, and childcare, interspersed with long stretches of rest. And evenings, once food was secured, tended to be dominated by one activity above all others: talking, storytelling, gossip, conflict resolution, teaching children through spoken narrative, verbal social interaction that anthropologists increasingly believe wasn't just entertainment, but the primary mechanism through which culture, cooperation, and shared knowledge got transmitted at all. Some researchers estimate that hunter-gatherer groups spent several hours a day, every day, simply sitting together around a fire, talking, not because they had nothing better to do, because, from an evolutionary standpoint, this might have been one of the most important things they could do, building the social bonds and shared understanding that made cooperative survival possible in the first place. There's also a genuinely strange detail buried in historical sleep research that fits this picture. Historian Roger Eckert's research on pre-industrial sleep patterns found extensive documentary evidence, court records, diaries, medical texts, describing something called segmented sleep, a first sleep of several hours, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness lasting an hour or more, often used for reflection, prayer, or conversation, followed by a second sleep until morning. This pattern appears to have been the normal, unremarkable way people slept for most of pre-industrial history, only disappearing within the last couple hundred years, largely following the introduction of artificial lighting and rigid work schedules. It's a small detail, but it reinforces the larger point: the tightly scheduled, single-block sleep-then-work structure that feels like basic human nature to us today is actually a fairly recent invention, not a biological default. So where does that leave us? Ethnographic time allocation studies suggesting under 20 hours a week of subsistence work. Skeletal evidence suggesting hunter-gatherers were often healthier, taller, and less physically strained than the farmers who came after them. Tens of thousands of years of art, adornment, and music that required serious, uncommitted time to produce. A daily rhythm apparently dominated by rest, food processing, and long stretches of social conversation, and a sleep pattern that only became rigid and single-block within the last few centuries. None of this means hunter-gatherer life was easy in some simple, romanticized sense. Food insecurity during bad seasons was real. Violence, illness, and unpredictable danger were part of that world in ways modern life mostly insulates us from. This isn't a case for abandoning modern medicine or safety nets, but it does complicate a story we tend to take for granted: that human history is one long march of increasing effort in exchange for increasing security, culminating naturally in the 40-hour workweek as some kind of evolved endpoint. Roughly 10,000 years ago, that changed. Agriculture arrived, and with it, something researchers sometimes call the agricultural trap. Farming produced more total food, which allowed populations to grow, but growing populations then required more total farming just to keep everyone fed, which meant more hours of repetitive physical labor per person, not fewer. Unlike hunting and gathering, which naturally self-limits around what a small group actually needs, agriculture created a feedback loop where more work reliably produced more people, who then needed more work. Once that loop started, there was no obvious point where anyone could simply decide to stop. We traded a smaller, more flexible workload for a larger, more secure food supply. And once that trade was made, across generations, there was no clean way back. Everything that followed, cities, specialized labor, eventually the modern concept of a job, with fixed hours and a wage, is downstream of that original trade, made by people who almost certainly had no idea what they were setting in motion, or what it would eventually cost in hours spent, bodies strained, and evenings no longer available for sitting around a fire, just talking. That's the strange part of this story that's easy to miss. It's not that ancient humans were happier or healthier in every way, or living some lost utopia we should try to return to. It's that the amount of your life currently allocated to work isn't some fixed law of human nature. It's the downstream result of one specific decision, made 10,000 years ago, that quietly reshaped how much of a single human life gets spent on survival, and how much is left over for everything else.